Without a doubt, we live in difficult times. And it's in times like this that we need inspiration. We need God to speak to us and reaffirm the purpose of life, humanity, the purpose of our very life. Why are we alive now, and why should we get out of bed today? And the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, written by King Solomon, the preacher, the son of David, gives us the meaning of life. Let's delve into it together. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 23 says this in the New American Standard. So I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them all. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. Verse 18. Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool, yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 23. King Solomon compares wisdom and folly to discover if wisdom has any advantage. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, he looks at the wise and the fool in death. Quote, wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness, end quote, says verse 13, which really echoes Proverbs chapter 6, verse 23, and Psalm 119, verse 105. And yet both end up the same with death, and death is a reoccurring statement in verse 14, verse 16, and verse 21. The wise should have some advantage, but experience shows that the wise don't. The fact that death claims both the wise and the fool oppresses the preacher. I mean, look at Psalm 49, verse 10. In Ecclesiastes, he asks, quote, if death awaits us all, why be wise? Chapter 2, verse 15. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 15 has the first expression of this too is vanity in this section. This too is vanity. The wise may be forgotten, but according to Psalm 112, verse 6, the righteous will be remembered and not forsaken. So it's better to be righteous than to be wise. The result of his experiment is hatred and grief in verse 17. And the second statement of futility in this section is seen in verse 17, quote, everything is futility and striving after wind, end quote. The preacher goes dark. His second expression of hate is connected to the futility of his earnings, his financial gain, chapter 2, verses 18 through 23, because he can't keep it, verse 18. He can't protect it, verse 19 and 20, and he can't enjoy it, verse 21 through 23. Verse 19 contains the third expression of futility. This too is vanity. When reading this passage slowly, you can feel the weight of worthlessness as it overwhelms him. Under the sun. Under the sun is used 3 times in verses 18 through 20, showing that from the horizontal examination, people looking at people, just our viewpoint, just people looking at human life without the divine, death levels everything out. The wise, the foolish, the very productive, the wasteful partier, they all die and can't keep or protect the fruit of their lives. It echoes Jesus' words in the parable about the productive rich man. Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verses 20 and 21, Luke chapter 12, verses 20 and 21, quote, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. End quote. Therefore, what are we to do about it? Let's seek God's kingdom and lay up treasure in heaven. That's the answer. Ecclesiastes is such a dark and depressing book till you get to the end. The preacher, King Solomon, his depression and pessimism continues. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 3, the preacher asked, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? He asked that in chapter 1, verse 3. Well, in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, he seems to answer that question. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? What's the answer? Well, the fruit goes to someone else, someone who has not worked for it, and therefore a life dedicated to the wisdom and labor, a life dedicated to wisdom and labor is futile, painful, and grievous, according to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. In those verses, you can hear his frustration and depression as he twice states, this too is vanity, a great evil, and this too is vanity. Well, what is the conclusion or takeaway from this busy passage? I take 2 truths to heart. 1, righteousness is better than wisdom. It's a big truth. And 2, seek God's kingdom, laying up treasure in heaven, instead of focusing on earth's work, the fruit of my labor, and all this people to people, daily life, horizontal stuff. God provides meaning. God provides purpose. God provides fulfillment. Our efforts must be focused on our relationship and service to God above all the clutter of life. That's my takeaway. This topic is incredibly important, and we need time to think about the purpose of our individual lives. Why do I exist? And how can I make the most of the time that God has given me? If you're interested in delving into Ecclesiastes deeper, then I wrote a book in 2018. It's 50 pages. It's $1.98 on Amazon. It's for a Kindle, an e-reader, and it's called Search for Significance, an examination of Ecclesiastes. And I will put the link to this book on Amazon in the description below as an additional resource for you if you wish.